right, let's go here to question number 5. When was this particular book written? Well, the short answer to that question is it was written in AD 95. And we believe that it was written in AD 95 because of something that Irenaeus says in his Against Heresies. Now, keep in mind who Irenaeus is. Irenaeus is one generation removed from John. John the Apostle, the author of the book of Revelation, discipled a man named Polycarp. Polycarp, in turn, discipled a man named Irenaeus. So, those old E.F. Hutton commercials, when E.F. Hutton speaks, people listen. When Irenaeus speaks, we should listen because he's one generation removed from the Apostle John. And this is what Irenaeus says. He says, quote, "But if it had been necessary to announce his name plainly at the present time, it would have been spoken by him who saw the apocalypse." You don't know who he is. If God wanted you to know the name of the Antichrist, he would have revealed it in the book of Revelation through John. And then he, in the course of giving this explanation, tells you exactly when John wrote the book of Revelation from the island of Patmos. He mentions the apocalypse, the book of Revelation, and then the next sentence from Irenaeus is, for it modifies apocalypse. For it was not seen long ago, but almost in our time at the end of the reign of Domitian. So what Irenaeus is saying there is John wrote the book of Revelation at the end of the reign of Domitian. Domitian left the throne, the Roman emperor, in AD 96. And so we essentially believe that John wrote the book of Revelation in AD 95, almost at the end of Domitian's reign, according to the testimony here of Irenaeus. Now, this is a chart I got from Mark Hitchcock, who is an authority in this area. He wrote his doctoral dissertation at Dallas Seminary defending the Domitianic date of the book of Revelation. You can find his published dissertation on the pre-trib website. Go to pre-trib.org and you can see all of Dr. Mark Hitchcock's work there. But Dr. Mark Hitchcock, who has investigated this very carefully, says that Irenaeus said this in AD 180, and almost everybody followed what Irenaeus said. No one questioned it until the 6th century, where people started to second guess, well, maybe this was written in the reign of Nero in the 60s rather than the reign of Domitian in the 90s. So when you look at this external evidence, witnesses for the Domitianic date versus witnesses for the Neronian date, you can see very clearly that evidence for the Domitianic date goes all the way back to Irenaeus, who's just one generation removed from John. This Neronian date idea didn't even come into the imagination in any external source that we can find until the 6th century. And then after that, it doesn't show up until AD 900 and then AD 1100. So the external evidence in favor of the Domitianic date is very, very, very strong. And so is the internal evidence. For example, if you look at Revelation chapter 2, verse 4, it indicates that Ephesus had lost its first love. Now that's a statement of the 90s, not the 60s, because we have records of what was going on in the church at Ephesus in the 60s. We have the book of Ephesians. We have the 2 Timothy books written to young Timothy, who is pastoring in Ephesus, and there's no hint in any of those books that there was a loss of first love. The Christians had not fallen out of love with Jesus. But here in Revelation 2, verse 4, and Revelation 2, verse 6, they had left their first love. So that means decades had passed between the 60s and the 90s for the Christians in Ephesus to have lost their first love for Jesus. Also in Revelation 2, verse 6, it mentions of some false teaching, the Nicolaitans. That was not something happening in Ephesus in the 60s because the Timothy books, the Ephesians epistle never mentions the Nicolaitans. So this type of statement in Revelation 2, verse 4 and verse 6 does not fit the 60s, what we know about Ephesus, but it could easily fit the 90s because several decades had passed and there was time for apostasy to occur amongst the believers at the church at Ephesus. When you look at Revelation chapter 3 and you look at verse 17, it describes a prosperous Laodicea. Jesus says, because you say I am rich and have become wealthy and have need of nothing, and you do not know that you are wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. Laodicea was financially prospering when the book of Revelation was written. Now, that cannot describe Laodicea of the 60s, because there was a giant earthquake in Laodicea, which destroyed the city. And the city in the 60s was decimated and in financial recovery. In fact, the currency that we know of Laodicea in the 60s does not fit Christ's statement here concerning Laodicea in Revelation chapter 3. There's a great scholar that has looked into these circumstances named Colin Hemmer, who goes through, all of the archaeology of Laodicea of the 60s, talks about the earthquake, and demonstrates that Laodicea of the 60s was not in prosperity. But when Jesus addressed the church at Laodicea, the city had recovered. So obviously the date of the book of Revelation doesn't fit the 60s, but it does fit very well the 90s, because it would take several decades for the city and the church to financially recover following that earthquake that happened decades earlier. And they recovered to the point where they didn't even think they need God anymore, because they were so financially prosperous. So that's what we mean by internal evidence. When you look at the way these churches are described, whether it's Ephesus or Laodicea, the description doesn't fit the 60s, but it fits very well the 90s. So all things considered, we believe that this book, the book of Revelation, was written at the end of the first century by the Apostle John from Patmos in AD 95. The external and the internal evidence supports that. Now, having said that, I want to make you aware of the fact that there is a very aggressive attempt today among some evangelicals to date the book of Revelation in the 60s rather than the 90s. It was written during the Neronian time period, they say, rather than the Domitianic time period. And the people that are primarily promoting that today are a group of people called preterists. Preterist is a Latin word that means past or gone by. And their basic belief of the book of Revelation is that the book of Revelation already happened. They see it as a prophecy or prophecies that were fulfilled when Rome sacked Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, there are different varieties of preterists. Some are full preterists, meaning they think the whole book of Revelation has already happened. Those folks, I believe, are heretical, because every ecumenical creed in Christendom acknowledges a future coming of Christ in some form or substance. But a full preterist is someone who basically believes the whole book of Revelation already happened. Now, there are other varieties of preterism that are partial preterists. They save a few scraps for the end. Kenneth Gentry, Gary DeMar, those kinds of people believe that Revelation 20 verses 7 through 10 is yet future, yet everything else in the book of Revelation already happened. That's basically what you call a preterist. Some examples of modern day either full or partial preterists. I think most of these folks here are partial preterists would be the late R.C. Sproul, N.T. Wright, Scott Hahn, Hank Hanegraaff, Kenneth Gentry, David Chilton wrote a partial preterist commentary on the book of Revelation. Another interpreter named Ford wrote a preterist commentary on the book of Revelation. And in order for preterism to work, in other words, in order for the book of Revelation to be a prophecy about Rome sacking Jerusalem in AD 70, the book had to have been written around AD 65. Because the moment you say the book was written in the 90s, 25 years after Rome sacked Jerusalem, is the moment you can't make this a prediction or a prophecy about AD 70. Something can't be a prophecy about AD 70 if it was written 25 years after AD 70. So in order for the preterist system to work, and they've sort of hitched their whole wagon to this early date argument, they have a vested interest in dating the book in the 60s rather than in the 90s. Because if it was written in the 90s rather than the 60s, then the whole preterist system goes up in flames. It goes up in smoke. So the people that really today are arguing very aggressively that the book of Revelation was written in the days of Nero rather than Domitian are preterists. They make a lot of noise about this. Now, there are people that are non-preterists, futurists, that believe essentially Revelation 4 through 22 is yet future, that still believe in the 60s date. The late Zane Hodges we can put in that category. But their position is kind of a minority position. And it's kind of interesting. You can believe in the 60s date or the 90s date and still be a futurist. But the preterist, whether it's a partial preterist or full preterist, has no similar luxury. They have to have the 60s date to make it a prophecy of AD 70. And Kenneth Gentry, in his book entitled Before Jerusalem Fell, which Mark Hitchcock was responding to in his Dallas Seminary doctoral dissertation, Kenneth Gentry is probably the key scholar that the preterists follow, arguing that the book was written in the 60s rather than the 90s. And so, I can be very glib here and just kind of let it roll off my tongue that we believe that this book was written in the 90s rather than the 60s. But I want you to understand that this is hotly contested, this AD 95 date, primarily, not exclusively, but primarily by preterists. Because if they can't have this early date, then the whole preterist system dissolves. Revelation can't be a prophecy about AD 70 if it was written 25 years after AD 70. So you'll find people like Hanegraaff, N.T. Wright, R.C. Sproul, etc., arguing for an early date of the book of Revelation, and there's a theological motivation why they are doing so. Notice what R.C. Sproul says. I understand that R.C. Sproul is extremely popular in the Christian world, and some people act like if you contradict R.C. Sproul, you're contradicting the Apostle Paul himself. It's not a matter of mishearing something R.C. Sproul said over the radio. He wrote a published book on this topic. The title of his book is The Last Days According to Jesus, where he is arguing for the partial preterist position, and he's consequently having to argue for an early date for the book of Revelation. Sproul writes, and if people are uncomfortable with me critiquing Sproul, just pick up the book yourself and read it, and you'll see very clearly what he is trying to argue for. I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate, spent a ton of time with this because my master's thesis was trying to refute the preterist interpretation of Revelation 13. My doctoral dissertation was trying to refute the preterist interpretation of Revelation 17 and 18. So if there's a topic that I know really, really well, it's this whole subject of preterism, because both my master's thesis and doctoral dissertation were trying to take down, if you will, the preterist viewpoint. So Sproul, in his book, The Last Days According to Jesus, says, quote, if the book of Revelation was written after AD 70, then its contents manifestly do not refer to the events surrounding the fall of Jerusalem, unless the book is a wholesale fraud having been composed after the predicted events had already occurred, close quote. And he's saying, we've hitched our preterist wagon that Revelation is a prophecy about AD 70 to an AD 65 date. So let me give you some of the arguments that they use to argue for this. As you look at these, you'll see that most of these are not very strong arguments at all. First of all, some internal evidence. Notice what Revelation 13 verse 18 says about the Antichrist. It says, well, let's read Revelation 13, 17, and 18. It says, and he provides that no one will be able to buy or to sell except the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast. The number is that of a man. His number is 666. They do not believe, the preterists, that this is a prophecy about the future Antichrist the way we believe it. They believe it's a prophecy about Nero, given to John just a few years before Nero in the first century came to power. And they get this from something called gematria. Gematria is the idea that ancient alphabets had a number attached to each letter. And you can work this out both in Greek and Hebrew. Every letter had a number. And so you could take the total letters in a person's name, attach the proper digits to the right letter, add up the digits, and everybody's name could be reduced to a number in the ancient world, both in Greek and Hebrew. And they think Nero's name adds up to 666. So that's why they think John is actually making a prediction about Nero in Revelation 13. He's not talking about a future Antichrist. And so since John is talking about Nero in Revelation 13, the book of Revelation had to be written before the time of Nero. So they date the book around AD 65. What they do is they spell out the name Caesar Nero, Kaiser Neron in Hebrew. They go to this gematria chart and they attach the right number to the right letter. They add up all of the numbers and it yields the total 666. And they say, look, this is a prediction about Nero. Nero's name in gematria adds up to 666. Therefore, the book of Revelation must have been written earlier than the time when Nero came to power. And this actually becomes one of the internal evidence arguments that they use to assign a very early date for the book of Revelation. Of course, this whole idea is fraught with problems. First of all, why in the world are you running the calculation in Hebrew when John in the book of Revelation is addressing a Greek-speaking audience in Asia Minor? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. Number two, you're cherry picking to fit a preordained outcome because to make this work, you had to throw in his title, Caesar. Whereas the book of Revelation never talks about a title. It talks about the name of the beast. It says in Revelation 13, verse 17, he provides that no one will be able to buy or to sell except the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name. So nothing here about a title. And what this is actually saying is one of these days, yet future, the Antichrist is going to show up. You'll be able to take his name, convert it into Greek, attach the right numbers to the right letter, add up the total, and it will yield the total 666. That's why the whole world, by the time the Antichrist shows up, will know exactly who he is. And if you worship him, there's no excuse for you, because the whole world will be able to identify the Antichrist as the Antichrist. So it's got nothing to do with throwing in his title, Caesar. It's got to do with purely his name. But the preterists, in order to get their system to work, have to throw in the title because the name Nero itself does not add up to 666. So that's what we mean by cherry picking. Another problem with this was never suggested by any of the ancient commentators. No ancient church father that we know of thought that Revelation 13 was a prophecy about Nero. In fact, the whole idea that 666 equals Nero's name doesn't show up in scholarship until liberals in Germany and the higher critical movement came up with this. And that's the problem with the preterist view coming into evangelicalism, is they're borrowing from German higher criticism, liberalism, and bringing it into evangelical interpretation. And they're not even able to find anybody that connected Nero with 666, Revelation 13, 17, and 18 until the 1800s. I mean, Irenaeus, Polycarp, all the way back. No ancient church father ever suggested this as an alternative and as an option. Now, that's very interesting because what they say to us all the time is you guys invented the rapture doctrine in the 1800s. Well, that's not true, first of all, but let's assume it is true. The rapture doctrine doesn't breathe in church history until the 1800s. Aren't they doing the same thing with 666? So they're inconsistent in how they argue their eschatological points. Another major problem with this is how inconsistent the preterists are with numbers. They're the first to tell you that the number 1,000, Revelation 20, is not literal. The number 144,000 and 12,000 in Revelation 7 is not literal. They give you these long-winded speeches on why you can't take the numbers in the book of Revelation literally, and yet look what they're doing with 666. It's a very literal number. In fact, it's so literal that you can use it to identify Caesar Nero back in the first century. And by the way, they do that with 42 months. 42 months doesn't mean exactly 42 months. 1,000 doesn't mean exactly 1,000. 12,000 doesn't mean exactly 12,000. 144,000 doesn't mean exactly 144,000, but 666 is literal. And this is how you can recognize that it's a false teaching, because their approach to the whole book of Revelation is inconsistent. Beyond that, Nero did not fit the information or fulfill the information in Revelation 13. He did not usher in persecution for 42 months. He did not control the entire planet. He did not force people to receive a mark on their right hand or forehead in order to participate in the global economy. You might be able to draw a few faint similarities between Revelation 13 and Nero, but what about all the differences? Nero did not coerce the entire world to worship a singular image of his. I've looked into this very carefully. Nero forced people to worship images, plural, of his, not a singular image. And that singular image was certainly not set up in the Jewish temple. Beyond that, Nero never resurrected from the dead. Revelation 13, verse 14 of the future Antichrist says, "He deceives those who dwell on the earth because of the signs which it was given him to perform in the presence of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who had the wound of the sword and has come to life." The Greek word is zoao. It's actually the same verb used to describe the resurrection of Jesus in Revelation 2, verse 8. Now, we'll be getting to this as we get into the book of Revelation, but I think it's talking about a literal resurrection of Antichrist, just like Jesus literally resurrected from the dead. And if that interpretation is true, then did Nero rise from the dead? Of course not. So Revelation 13 does not equal Nero. Nero never associated with a miracle-working false prophet. Nero never received global veneration. And so you put all of this information together, and the whole argument for the early dating of the book of Revelation from Revelation 13, verse 18, it's a specious, spurious argument. The second internal evidence argument that they give is found in Revelation 17, verse 10, where it says, "Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. They are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other is yet to come. And when he comes, he must remain a little while." So they make a big deal here about these 7 kings. 5 have fallen, and they say the first one was Julius Caesar, the second one was Augustus Caesar, the third one was Tiberius Caesar, the fourth one was Caligula, the 5th king was Claudius Caesar, and the one who is. And that's a big deal, because they say if you can identify that one, you could show exactly when the book of Revelation was written, because John says the 6th one is the one who is. And they say number 6 is Nero. Nero reigned from AD 54 to 68. So if the one is Nero, John must have written this book in the reign of Nero. And then the one who is yet to come, number 7, is Galba, who would follow Nero. So this is one of their internal evidence arguments that they use to support an early date for the book of Revelation. Well, that's no argument at all for a couple reasons. You got to make a lot of assumptions to come up with king number 6 as Nero. First of all, what's your starting point? Which king did you start with? Why did you start with Julius Caesar? Was there no Roman emperor before Julius Caesar? And what about those Roman emperors that were coronated and died really quick? In fact, it happened so fast, a lot of them aren't even included in the different counts of the Roman emperors. So you're making a lot of assumptions concerning the starting point. You're making a lot of assumptions concerning who to include. This is a chart that comes from David Aune in his Revelation commentary, and he shows you all the different ways of doing this count. And there are lots of different ways of counting the 6, up to the 6, which have nothing to do with Nero. Beyond that, when you look at Revelation 17, 9, and 10 very carefully, it says they are 7 kings, and the prior verse says they are 7 mountains. Now, a mountain in the Bible is describing a kingdom, not just a king, but a kingdom. Daniel 2, verses 37 and 38 calls Nebuchadnezzar a king of a kingdom, which is represented by the head of gold. So it's very unlikely that John is just focused on kings in Revelation 17, 9, and 10, but he's also focused on kingdoms. And when we get there, I'll show you that these 7 kings or kingdoms are better identified as Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and then the kingdom which was in place when John wrote the book of Revelation, Rome, and then what is yet to come, a revived Roman Empire coming into existence, yet future in the tribulation period, or the events surrounding the tribulation period, called Rome Phase 2. So when you see these not as individual kings only, but kingdoms, the whole basis of documenting Nero as number 6 crumbles as well. A third internal evidence argument that they use is the reference to the temple in Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. Notice what Revelation 11, 1 and 2 says. It says, "There was given me a measuring rod like a staff, and someone said, 'Get up and measure the temple.'" The Greek there is naos, the temple of God and the altar, "and worship in it. Leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. Now, what early date advocates believe this is speaking of is temple number 2. They think it's a prophecy about temple number 2, which was not destroyed by Rome until AD 70. And since the temple is functioning and in existence, this is a reference to temple number 2 pre-AD 70. So therefore the book of Revelation must have been written in the 60s. It can't be written post-AD 70 because by then the temple was destroyed. So the preterists and early date advocates believe that Revelation 11, 1 and 2 is a prophecy about temple 2. Israel has 4 temples in her history, 2 past, 2 future. Solomon's temple, destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. Then the returnees built the temple, rebuilt it. That's the one destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. And the preterists think this is dealing with temple number 2. Since temple number 2 was destroyed in AD 70, and since this is a prediction about temple number 2, then the book must have been written pre-AD 70. Well, what we believe is this is not, the short answer to this is not a prediction about temple number 2. This is a prediction about temple number 3, because Scripture anticipates a future temple that the Antichrist will desecrate midway through the tribulation period. That temple is going to be destroyed, I believe, in the 7th bowl judgment, and then replaced by the millennial temple during the 1,000-year reign of Christ, Ezekiel 40 through 48. Now, notice this sequence here. It demonstrates that God's prophets can have a vision about a temple, yet future, when none is standing in the city of Jerusalem. Temple number 2 was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. That temple would not be, got my numbers backwards, let me rephrase that. Temple number 1, there we go, was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC on the eve of the Babylonian captivity. So from 586 BC until 515, when temple number 2 was built by the returnees returning from the exile, from 586 BC to 515 BC, the nation of Israel did not have a functioning, standing temple during the days of the Babylonian captivity, the 70-year captivity. And yet Ezekiel in 573 and Daniel, 3 times in the book of Daniel, 551 BC, 538 BC, 536 BC, had visions, both Ezekiel and Daniel, of a future temple when none was actually standing there in Jerusalem. So the point of this is, if Ezekiel and Daniel can make predictions about a future temple when none was standing in Jerusalem, why can't John be doing that in Revelation 11? Of course he can. John could easily write in the 90s, after temple number 2 had been destroyed, and still under the Holy Spirit's inspiration receive predictive prophecies about a 3rd temple yet coming. So once again, if you're going to use Revelation 11, 1 and 2 to argue that the book of Revelation had to have been written in the 60s because it's can only be a prophecy about temple number 2, which was destroyed in AD 70, and therefore the book of Revelation had to have been written pre-AD 70. If that's your argument, it's a specious, spurious argument, because John could very well be having a prophecy about a temple yet future after temple number 2 had been destroyed by the Romans. After all, Ezekiel and Daniel had these kinds of prophecies all the time. They had predictions of coming temples when no temple was standing in Jerusalem. Why can't John be doing the same thing? So this again becomes almost no argument at all for dating the book in the reign of Nero in the 60s. John in Revelation 11, 1 and 2 is not talking about temple number 2. He's talking about temple number 3, yet future, that the Antichrist will desecrate. A fourth internal evidence argument is people say, well, if John had written the book of Revelation in the 90s, after AD 70 had happened, why does John never make a back reference to AD 70? Now, Hank Hanegraaff, who in his book, The Apocalypse Code, was aggressively promoting at one time this preterist perspective. He even tried to write a fiction series to rival what Tim LaHaye had done through the Left Behind series, just from a preterist angle. And while Tim LaHaye's series was wildly successful, Hank Hanegraaff's series was not successful at all. No one even knows he even wrote it, to be quite honest with you, where Tim LaHaye's Left Behind series went everywhere. But one of the things Hanegraaff would say is, well, this book couldn't have been written in the 90s, because if it had been written after AD 70, the book would have made some kind of reference to what happened in AD 70. And he would kind of use this argument. It's similar to writing a book about American history post 9/11, but never looking backward to mention 9/11. Well, there's actually a reason for that. It has to do with the command of God. What did God tell John to do in Revelation 1, verse 19? Therefore write the things which you have seen, the things which are, and the things which will take place after these things. In AD 95, write what you have seen, the vision of the glorified Christ, Revelation 1. Write the things that are. AD 95, the state of the 7 churches in Asia Minor. And then write down the things that will take place after these things. The futuristic section of the book, Revelation 4 through 22. Now, if John had just turned around with a rearview mirror and started talking about what happened 25 years earlier in AD 70, he would have disobeyed what God told him to do when God gave him this vision. So you would have to turn John into a disobedient apostle and prophet to get him to reflect backward as to what happened in AD 70. So when you analyze these different arguments that they use to date the book pre-AD 70, the internal evidence arguments, they're really not arguments at all. They're very quickly and easily answered. As far as external evidence is concerned, the preterists have a very difficult time with this, because the first unambiguous Neronian reference to the arguing for the Neronian date of the book doesn't show up until the 6th century AD. I mean, what's the first external evidence source that's clear that the book was written in the reign of Nero rather than Domitian? That doesn't show up until the Syriac version of the New Testament, 6th century. And then it doesn't show up again until Arethusa, AD 900. And then it doesn't show up again until Theophylacte, there we go, AD 1100. Whereas the Domitianic evidence goes all the way back to Irenaeus, who's one generation removed from John. So as far as external evidence goes, the preterists have no argument. As far as internal evidence goes, the preterists have no argument. And so we believe that this book was written in AD 95, not AD 65. Robert Thomas, I think, puts the stake in the heart of preterism when he writes this: what does a localized judgment hundreds of miles away have to do with the 7 churches in Asia Minor? The promise to shield the Philadelphian church from judgment is meaningless if that judgment occurs far beyond the borders of the city. I mean, the preterist system is basically saying, yeah, the book of Revelation was written to the 7 churches in Asia Minor, but the content of the book concerns what Rome did to Israel Israel hundreds of miles away. Well, how does what Rome did to Israel hundreds of miles away have anything to do with the 7 churches in Asia Minor? So what the preterists have done is they've taken the prophetic, futuristic content of the book and completely removed them from any relevance that these would have to the churches in Asia Minor, because they're making this about something that Rome did to Jerusalem, which is hundreds of miles removed from the churches in Asia Minor. I find that very interesting because people say that's what we as futurists have done. I'll answer this in a moment, but they say because you guys put the prophetic content 2,000 years into the future for fulfillment, it has nothing to do with the first century churches. Well, isn't that what the preterist argument has done? Since Jerusalem, invaded by Rome, AD 70, is hundreds of miles away from modern day Turkey. That's just something to consider. So, date of the book, AD 95.